Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. So today we're going to be talking about accelerating human quality. That's very important, human quality translation in the real world, also very important. I'll explain more what I mean by that. And from the point of view of us builders, that means building verification for the original generative task, right, being translation. A little bit about me and why I'm somewhat qualified to give this talk. I basically quit generation to start working on building verification. I used to be at Google Translate. Currently, I'm the CEO of ModelFront, which is the first and main company that provides verification for translation. ModelFront builds verification that works in the real world, right? And so at this point, it's trusted with millions of words of valuable content. It's really only for that, like tech docs and patents, and mainly from Fortune 500s. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about verification versus generation and how they're different and how they fit together. Why it's so valuable, why verification is so valuable, why it's so hard, right? Why very few companies have been able to do it, why it kind of has lagged way behind generation, even though maybe it seems simpler to say something is good or bad versus to generate it. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So I'm going to try to go very fast and leave you lots of time to ask your questions. So yeah, firstly, about verification versus generation. How many of you, by the way, work on generation in some capacity for some task, some AI model that spits out something? So as you probably know, right, the model architecture behind Gen AI essentially started in translation. The transformer was invented and published and launched for Google Translate in 2017. And it wasn't just research, it was widely adopted. And so for human quality translation, the job shifted from humans writing from scratch to humans editing and verifying the output of AI. And it was the first job to do that. So what I see right now as an engineer, right, happening to engineers, that already happened 10 years ago at scale for translation, and really going back as far as like 2002, Sun and Silicon Valley had introduced post-editing in the early 2000s, right? And that had kind of grown over time, right? So they like to say translation is the world's second oldest profession, right? And it was also very, very quick to adopt AI. And so, we'll talk a little bit more about how that impacted that. The basic workflow changed from just having humans to having generation from humans and then humans, right? Very simple. I don't want to make something sound more complicated than it is. I want to make it sound simpler than it is. So that's basically what we're talking about here. So as an example, right, previously, before there was verification, you would have something like this, right? This is basically how things looked in like 2015 or 2020. You have, this is a test of the emergency broadcasting system. Saartakark, man hamakarki portsarkume. And then a professional human translator looks at this and says, do I need to edit? I have to read everything, and says, okay, that one looks good, right? And then the next segment comes, the next sentence, and it gets generated by Google Translate or whatever. And then that person says, actually, you know what, this is like not a very good translation, right? Like silver bullet, at least it didn't literally translate silver, but like magic bullet also isn't something you say in Armenian, right? And so I tried to find some idiomatic expression, right? In this case, right? So that's the kind of work we're talking about. So in many cases, you make an edit, and in many other cases, you just spend all the time, right? The translators were right, they spend a lot of time on this segment, maybe more because it's longer, on this segment, but they end up not editing it in the end, right? And so we got just radically better generation, right? So even the biggest skeptic of AI would say that, 10 years ago it was even worse, right? Which means way worse, which means now it's way better, and it is, right? It's just amazing. And I think most of us, if we had seen the generation that we have today, 10 years ago, we would have said, wow, it's solved, if I had just been able to play around with the system. And I actually think that would have been true again 10 years ago, like if in 2005 you had seen a 2015 system, you also might have said, wow, it's solved, right? So I guess the question is, like, why didn't we get more human quality translation? This is like a little bit of a Peter Thiel argument, right? So like, we were promised all these things, we expected all these things, we kind of expect progress to be like this. In this case, unlike the trains and the planes and stuff, the technology is getting better. Generation is objectively way better than it was 10 years ago. So I would expect that we no longer have this crazy thing where all in English we have all this information, but in German, let alone in Armenian, you have 10x less information available, 10x, even 100x less content in Armenian, and Armenian is a pretty well represented language, and you go to smaller languages, Swahili or Kurdish or something, and almost nothing, right? So something went wrong, let's say. If I'm a large translation buyer, and I'm trying to translate all my content, maybe 10 million words a year, I'm also pretty unhappy. I'm looking around and saying, I'm trying DeepL, I'm trying ChatGPT, it's really awesome. Why is my bill the same? Why can't I get more languages? Why can't I have more content go through every year at the same quality for the same price, right? So progress basically failed to happen. So you can say better generation alone failed to accelerate human quality translation, which I kind of had to accept as somebody who had worked on generation. It was really good for not human quality translation, right? So when you go around the world and you sit in a taxi and you talk with the driver and you say, oh, I used to work on Google Translate, or you see them using it, they think it's great because their previous alternative was no translation. So for that, it's great. But for the high quality content, which is what we're talking about today, the stuff that was so valuable that people wanted to pay for it before there was machine translation, it's like pushing on a string. And the reason is what the translator said. If we still need to manually verify every single sentence that's edited, even if no edit is needed, then it's not actually faster. So there are other tasks that are not like that. For example, if I generate an image, to just verify an image, for me, I'm not a great painter, and even if I were, it's a million times faster for me to say, yep, that's a good image, I'd like that one, or choose from these 10 images, choose the one I like most, than to paint that image. It might take me a year, or maybe I'm not even capable of painting that image. Translation is not like that. If you're a professional human translator, you can bang out those words basically as fast as you can sort of cognitively load them. It's the cognitive effort that takes the time. And so the proof is the price. I'm a capitalist, right? It still costs basically $1 a sentence. And the effect on the price has not come from this shift to post-editing AI at all. I would argue it's come from more people coming online, from inflation, et cetera, et cetera. That's what's moving the price, not AI. So verification is used to skip the manual work for sentences that humans would verify unedited anyway. So in the new workflow, you have generation, for example, Google Translate. You have then verification. If the translation is good, it just skips and goes ahead to the next step, maybe goes to the final translation. If it's not good, then we go back to the old workflow. Somebody needs to take a look at it. And then there's one other thing that goes on here. So a lot of times you say, okay, let's look at those translations that are not good. Let's look at those translations that are requiring an edit. And many of those edits are very, very trivial. For example, changing a curly apostrophe to a straight apostrophe 1,000,000 times. Nobody wants to pay for that. Nobody became a professional translator to do that, right? So that's a perfect candidate for automation. And so there is now another type of model for editing called automatic post-editing, which then edits that translation. Now there's a big misconception about automatic post-editing. A lot of folks think that it could be used like instead of humans, or instead of verification, or after it goes here, that it can go right to the end. But it's very important to say that this is, again, just like machine translation or ChatGPT, it's something untrusted, And so this then needs to go back again to verification, and it may still be rejected, in which case it still goes to humans, or it may be approved, in which case it can skip that manual human step, right? So these are the kind of systems that the most advanced companies are currently using to do human quality translation. Basically looks like this. It's a pretty standard human-in-the-loop system. So an example of this new workflow, we again have the same sentence that's get generated. Now, if verification says it's good to go, we're done. If we get a sentence that it rejects, then it's still going to go, and this is what the data set looks like. Then you have them making those edits upon rejection. So. Verification is very valuable. I think generation is almost worth nothing, right? The prices of the APIs are very cheap, and if I give you, 1 million words generated by Google Translate or generated by ChatGPT, you're essentially not willing to pay anything for it because you don't know if it's good or bad, right? And to really make it human quality, you'd have to have somebody look at it. After somebody looks at it, it's worth quite a lot. And so verification sort of unlocks these. Most Fortune 500s are spending millions a year to translate their content. They're doing millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of words a year of content. And if it were scalable, they'd translate more. They'd like to do more content. They'd like to do more languages. But at the way things are going, like the old way of doing things where you manually post edit every single word, they can't scale even at their budgets, right? It doesn't make sense. So this is not about cutting. This is about growing and actually being able to have the content available in more languages for more people. That said, verification is very hard. So I think, great companies like Google tried and failed to make machine translation quality estimation research work in the real world. Quality estimation is what this was known as, going back since around 2013. And that, right, they saw it's valuable, which is why they tried. But for whatever reason, I'm naming Google, but you can take every single big company, right? I can't name all of them because they've told me this in confidence, right? But really the majority of the large tech companies have tried to do something like this, either to sell it or just to use it for their own translation over the years, because it is like kind of a really obviously valuable idea. So I want to say a disclaimer here. Firstly, the big companies should not be shamed for trying. I think if anything, right, they don't try enough, they don't take enough risks. So when they do take a risk, right, and essentially use their dollars to invest in something that would be good for humanity, I don't think we should criticize them or criticize, you're not criticizing the company, you're criticizing people who inside that company took a risk and argued to do that. And secondly, I named Google because it's great, right? So, like I said, they invented the transformer. They made Waymo work. Self-driving cars are now a reality, right? So this is not a company to take lightly with regard to AI. And I would say they still have the greatest density of talent and so on, and execution, as we see with Waymo. So my point here is to say that even Google failed, right? So it's very, very hard, let alone all the other companies. So again, not to pick on them. And so I think we've covered why it's valuable. I'd like to also cover now, spend the rest of the time on why verification is so hard. So firstly, we underestimate how hard verification is. I underestimated it, right? And it's interesting to think about why. I think that both buyers and builders like me, we overfit on generation, right? We're used to building and training machine translation and to using machine translation. And machine translation is relatively well understood. It's the first generative task. You have tons of tutorials out there. Machine translation is useful even when it's not perfect, right? So there are all these things, if you just are used to doing generation, right? And tons of companies have built machine translation, tons of them built it in-house, et cetera, right? You think, okay, well, verification, you don't even have to generate the words. You just have to say if it's good or bad. It must be easier, right? And again, the results say that that doesn't seem to be the case. And then I think the other thing is that as humans, we all kind of look for shortcuts and silver bullets, right? So we want to believe there's just one trick, one model hack, one better data set or something like that, and then one of these kind of problems gets solved, right? Whereas I would argue if you look at something like Waymo, like self-driving cars, it's extremely not like that. There is no silver bullet. It's a bunch of things that come together, that have to come together to make it a success in the real world. So I think first and foremost that the reason that so many companies failed was they simply underestimated it. Like they tried to do it with whatever, 2 people for 6 months or whatever, instead of recognizing that it might take 5 years, and for a much larger team. And then when it didn't go well, right, and then at some point they have to cut their losses, right, and understandably because it's not their main business. And I think the first thing is about the quality. So in the real world, verification requires human quality, right? Translation generation does not. So just what that quality bar really is was severely underestimated. Verification only creates direct value if it keeps the same final human quality for the task, right? Otherwise, you may just as well cut out the humans, cut out the verification, and just do generation. But this is not that kind of content. Human quality is not perfect, right? Just like human drivers are not perfect. But it is a very high bar. And they make sort of different kinds of mistakes than machines make. Human quality requires a separate model. Going back to taking shortcuts, and there being no silver bullet, right? As engineers, we say, well, we have a translation model. Its decoder has probabilities. We can kind of tease out a confidence score out of our translation model, right? And that ultimately didn't work. I saw this great quote from Paula Mansour at Booking. Basically, they did the test. If you generate translations with GPT and then use GPT as the judge to do verification, it will always favor its own translations, right? Because it's the same model. It was trained on the same data. So in the places where it has some idiosyncrasies, the verification model is going to have those same idiosyncrasies. The other thing here is that human quality requires custom models, not generic models, right? Different companies with regard to their content have very different topics, terminology, style, product names, et cetera. It's very, very specific. And I think this is quite obvious, actually. So if you as a enterprise buyer of translation asked a human translator to translate for you, and then you told that human translator, hey, would you like to see some previous translations or maybe a style guide or a little bit of, some maybe our terminology to, to translate this at a high quality, learn a little bit about our products, right? And that translator said, no, I don't need that. I don't even need to know what company it's for. You'd say, all right, something's off here, right? But on the engineering side, and right in these teams that tried this, they were essentially trying to get off easy and had this illusion that you could do that with AI, which is not even as smart as humans, that you could just have some generic model that works in these very specific contexts, right? So generic is not enough. Fine-tuning is also not enough. One of the obvious things that come to mind is that in machine translation, like Google Translate or Microsoft Translator, they do let you customize, and most enterprises use something like that and customize it. But it's not really realistic for them to customize differently for their technical docs versus their marketing material versus their UI strings. So they end up using the same engine for all of those without any kind of differentiation, and that's basically a recipe for failure. I would also warn that prompting is not enough, right? So if you just take GPT and you want to just throw in a few hints there, that's also not going to be enough. You're leaving a lot on the table because you do have millions and millions of words of training data from this specific workflow that you're then not using. The other thing is that human quality requires systems, not just a model, right? So again, as an engineer, especially as a student, the world is sort of framed as this Olympiad. It's Kaggle. You get a data set, and there's some metric, there's some test set, right? And you train, and then you submit your result, and you're done, right? It's sort of this sort of offline, one-time kind of thing. Imagine doing that for self-driving, right? It's not even wrong, right? The problem shape is so different. It's meta, it's at another level. And so when I say system, yeah, I mean something more like Waymo. So obviously you need data pipelines to come from all sorts of different sources. You need to be foundation model agnostic. These foundation models are just, changing all the time, getting better and better, and you need to be able to pull in the newest ones as soon as they're available. Obviously you have to have some sort of training pipeline as well that's relatively scalable. Evaluation. So I have a friend, for example, who works on self-driving planes, right? Self-driving cars, self-driving planes, translation verification, all have the property that you really need to trust it at some level. And I would say maybe not trust it, you need to test it. That's what evaluation is. And the thing is that not only do you need to test it, but the people who are supposed to consume it, buy it, regulate it, et cetera, they don't want to do the work of figuring out how to test it properly. So what they want is for you to come up with the evaluation methodology, you give it to them, and then they sign off on it and say, yeah, that makes sense. But essentially you need to do the work of figuring out how you can prove that these models are not damaging human quality. You need additional guardrails. I can say a little bit more about that, but essentially, right, just always throwing something to a model, even stuff that it hasn't seen before. You do need some things around that to prevent that. Integration, I'll say a little bit more about this in a second, right? But it has to be in the systems that people actually use. Monitoring, right? So, okay, it's up and live, it passed the evaluation, but how do I know that it didn't degrade, right? Again, very much like self-driving car systems. Retraining, right? So it's not just a one-off thing. The world is changing, the content changes, there are new words, new products, et cetera, and you have to constantly retrain. And there are a lot of things to think about at retraining time. And then there's sort of a whole life cycle. One of the problems that I like to bring up is so that in the most optimized workflows, where they have very nice content and they've sort of done everything right over the years, we're able to verify automatically 90%, right? And in that situation, after you get to that point, now you have 90% less data coming to you for the next retraining. Now, how do you deal with that, right? Because not only is it less, but it's shifted. All the good stuff was approved, and now you're only left with the bad stuff, right? And that really messes with your models. So there's all these kind of things to think about when you're sort of doing it in a lab versus doing it in reality. And the other thing is, of course, you have to have a team on call 24/7, right? So it's not just like something you give and forget and sell and move on, right? You have to be around the clock there for things that go wrong. In the real world, this is my daughter. In the real world, verification requires integration, as I mentioned. And so what do I mean by integration? There was this thing going around Silicon Valley maybe 10, 20 years ago when self-driving cars weren't working very well. And people were saying, well, if we could just remove the human drivers from the road, right? They're the problem. They're the one that cuts in front of you, right? I know in Armenia it's not like that, but and then they wanted like the stoplights to be changed. Maybe we would have put a QR code on the stoplights and stop signs and all that kind of stuff, right? Just really make it easy for automation. We're at the university, so I'm not allowed to say it, but there's a very good Russian quote. It's called, it starts with "Plokho mo tanцору," right? So basically, it was kind of excuses for failing to deliver something. That approach didn't work, right? In the end, we ended up with self-driving cars that actually work in the real world with people jumping in front of them, right? And human drivers and all of that. And so whatever you build, it has to work like an agent, just like inside of these existing systems that don't have the greatest APIs, right? They're not really made for this. And so you just kind of have to be like a human in there and just do that work, right? Without anything else changing. In the real world, verification, I would argue, required basically a new company. not just a new feature. It's just very, very hard when you're inside an existing successful business, product, team, et cetera, to stop and dedicate huge amount of resources to something as niche as this, especially when that thing could be like hurting your main business, and we'll talk about that, right? So firstly, you have to take responsibility for this, right? If, you know, this isn't something you can just kind of tack on and say like, oh, by the way, we have this too now, right? Maybe you'll like it, right? You really have to stand behind it because of the seriousness of what it is, right? So you can't have a conflict of interest, right? So for example, if you're selling human translation, you know, and then your engineer comes to you and says, we have a way to cut 50% of that. What are you going to do to him, right? Hopefully he survives till the morning, right? You know, I'm exaggerating. You're not going to do something really nasty, but it's very, very hard to really go invest and bet the company on something that's going to cut the company's revenue in half, or the department's revenue in half, and no lock-in, right? So. A lot of it, if you have an existing product, right, you're always tempted to add these features as a way to kind of beat your competition, keep somebody from moving to the competition, right? But that's not what the buyer wants. The buyer wants this thing, to just work. So that's all I have to say. I'm happy to answer your questions.
First of all, thank you for your talk. I had a question. How easy or hard would you find to translate text into like mathematical, like let's say it's a math problem. How easy or hard would you find to translate that into math, like notations purely?
To translate text into purely mathematical?
Yeah, math problems into like just texts, like in terms of math symbols and.
So you're saying to convert text into some numeric format?
Yeah.
Human language into some numeric format. Yeah. I mean, that is essentially how models work at some level, but it's not human readable mathematical format, if that's the question.
So my question was about just like math models converting into just purely math symbols.
I would say, I mean, that is how at some level every sentence inside of a model is represented as a vector, right? So it is turned into mathematical values. However, it's not human readable mathematical formulas. It has no meaning, right? Each dimension in the vector has no meaning, right? So, but in terms of like translating it into some sort of symbolic language, let's say, I essentially don't believe in that. A lot of people who say it, if that becomes a better approach, I would start using it, right? So I'm not a believer in using AI for the sake of AI, for example, but essentially that approach hasn't worked very well. And I think one of the reasons is that there's a lot of ambiguity in natural language, and sort of leaving it as language, as text, is great because you don't really have to resolve that ambiguity, right? So like, a good example would be like, I'll see you at 7. Now, if I say that in Armenian, Yotin keskatesnem, right? I don't have to say, did he mean 7 p.m. or like 19 or 7, right? I don't have to disambiguate that. I just leave that ambiguity in the language, right? So we always focus on those ambiguities that cause a problem with translation, but there's so many ambiguities that are perfectly fine on both sides, and any kind of hardcore representation would then be forced to solve more problems that weren't a problem.
So thank you very much. Okay, we got why it's hard and valuable, but how do you solve it? Like, what do you do?
I think that's the next talk. So we do a lot of the things that I talked about. So we obviously have a system, everything from having a data pipeline to use the right data and different kind of data, down to having people on call 24/7. So luckily I didn't know that when I started, that would all be required, but that's kind of the gist of it. I think one of the key things from a model architecture perspective that's maybe interesting, that we did very early on, starting 2019, 2020, when we founded the company, right? We saw that these multilingual LLMs were coming out, right? It's no coincidence that like OpenAI and everything, like we all started around this time because we saw this stuff was coming out and it was all of a sudden possible to do stuff that you couldn't do before. And so one of the ideas that had been kicking around at that time from Google, for example, was just using one model for all your language pairs. And it was a very good idea, but just the way that big companies are, they didn't do it. Not for translation, let alone for verification. And so when we started from day one, just both in terms of quality and in terms of like scalable infrastructure, we started using one model for all of your language pairs, but with a prompt to make it aware of the language pair and sort of fine-tuning that prompt into the model. And so, there's a lot of like good properties about that, like when we talk about disambiguation, for example. So much about translation is about ambiguity on the source side, not about problems in the target. And so that, that edit by a translator is telling you, oh, this source word means something different than you think about it. And it doesn't really matter if you're translating into Swahili or into Catalan, because it's about the English, right, what they mean there. So that was one of the I think, key things that we did different. And then just like having one big model for all your languages, another thing we did was differentiating content types. So that was something, again, where the technology was there. I'm going to say even 2015, to have one model and pass it a hint to say, hey, this is marketing, not technical docs. But somebody has to do it. And so we did it. Right, and so it was just a series of things over the years. I again want to say that there's no silver bullet, but we started off like that, and I like to think that every year we've done something like that that nobody else had done before in the real world, maybe in research, and just keep doing it and doing it like that.
Okay, thank you very much. And one more question regarding the evolution of the language in general. So what do you think, if this problem is not solved in 100%, so we cannot get automatic data, and with the rise of usage of GPT and generation models, do you think that the languages will evolve into this like new bad quality translation things? So for example, for Armenian, we just start using, artate, I forgot the word, pampusht instead of, shortcut.
Oh, this is an interesting one. I guess from the translation perspective, that's already been happening. So I'm talking 2010 or maybe earlier. I would do these quality, I forget what they call, quality analysis sessions inside of Google Translate. And I was like, maybe the language guy there in some ways. And back with statistical machine translation, you could actually see when you generated a bad translation, what were the examples on the web that we had crawled that caused that. With these newer models, you've kind of lost that to some degree, but we had that, and you'd be looking at this example like that caused this bad translation in Portuguese, and I'm looking at this Portuguese, right? And I know Spanish, I don't know Portuguese that well, and I'm like, there's something off with this. Man, this is machine translation that we crawled on and ate, and you go digging deeper and you realize it's not even our bad system from 1 year ago. It's Microsoft, those were the bad guys back then, right? Somebody translated a Word doc and threw it online, and now we trained on it, right? So this is not new. God knows what's happening now, right? And so just training on the web unstructured, you're totally right. It's a big problem. So there has to be some sort of ground truth that's not that. And I would stress the following, that OpenAI, for example, invests heavily in, reinforcement learning with human feedback, right? So their bill for human labeling, ranking mainly, is probably bigger than the translation budget of most companies, or like a whole segment of companies put together. So like there still is that human signal coming back, if you see what I'm saying. It's just more of a question of like who's paying for it, who gets to specify the style, right? Famously, they have their version of political correctness, values, et cetera, that they bake into the model. Customer of ours might prefer that their translators and style guide are the thing that the model gets fine-tuned on. So there is, in essence, always room for humans here. from that perspective. And I guess one more thing on that, right, is that these are companies who are doing, right, if it's patents, if it's new products, new features, fundamentally they want to decide, like, they decided what the name of that thing was in English or whatever the source language was, and they also want to decide what the name is going to be in the other languages when it occurs the first time.
Regarding the context, if I understood correctly, you mentioned, for instance, regarding the context, I remember you mentioned, for instance, different companies might have like different tone of voice or like these things. So do you train like a model per company, or do you like per language, not per language, like per company, or do you like train your model to be aware of the context? Like, for instance, is this like legal, tone of voice, like these things? Like, which approach are you like having?
It's very much per company, and we kind of knew that when we started. There was a lot we got wrong when we started, but it is in the name model front. We said we have to build a model factory, which is now possible, as of that time. So everyone needs their own private custom model for this task, each company.
So imagine that my company is like a small company and we only have like, I don't know, like 500 documents. Do you only like solely like rely on that, or?
So that is one of the open problems, right? So currently we're only really able to do this for some of the world's largest translation buyers. And that's very unfortunate, of course, and you can also look at it as they're kind of funding human progress. And so I do think long term, like the way that the technology is going, that this will become more accessible. But we're very far off from being able to do it for 500 documents if it's a one-time thing.
Even if it is like a big company, imagine, for instance, it's Wix.com, right? They have like millions of customers, but each customer is a different like business, and they have like different tone of voice. Even like one company, if it is finance versus if it is like, I don't know, like advertisement, it might be different. Right?
Exactly, right? So I think the best example is probably gaming. So each game essentially has its own vocab, et cetera, and then it's done. Right, and it's not that much volume. So yeah, I think all automation is like this to some degree, right? Always, it's sort of like the superhighway is the easy thing to automate, and like Cond is going to be like the last place to get the self-driving cars, right? So.
Yeah, actually, I think my question builds on the previous one. So I was wondering, have you ever worked with literary works? Because in that case, you need to consider the author's like tone of voice again, like, so you cannot really look at the sentences individually, and the poems are like completely another direction. So I was wondering, have you thought how to work in the case where you're going to have only like one work from the author and you need to look at it like comprehensively?
That will definitely require some improvements from where things are now. So, right, the question is about literature and books. They are a case, right, where context across segments matter, but I would say that it also matters quite a bit for the content we currently do, right? A marketing blog, they also have a flow and refer, they have anaphora and a refer across sentences. So it's more of a matter of degree. And then you have to weigh the other side, which is, again, it is a book that then ends. So if it's a fiction book, et cetera, and it's sort of made up stuff that doesn't occur in another book, then yeah, it's typically not worth it. And that corner of the translation world, let's say, is for now less automated, for sure.
Hello. If I listen correctly, you said that Google used one big model for each pair of language translation, right?
No, we don't use one model per language pair. That would require us to run, if thinking of all our customers and all their language pairs and content types, it would just require tens of thousands of models to be running at any one time. Yeah.
Hi. I would like to ask if you know how Grammarly works. So how can it verify itself, or how can it make changes, edit the text and verify itself? And how does a verification system distinguish like the speech differences and the actual translation errors?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the biggest differences here between Grammarly and the kind of verification we're talking about is one is at the sentence level and one is at the word level. And so, you know, if I'm a writer, or you know, I make a typo or I make a grammatical mistake and Grammarly gives me a very detailed suggestion, that's nice, right? And we all use tools like that. If I'm buying 1 million translations or more, right? I don't want somebody to tell me, hey, here's the error. Because then somebody still has to go look at it. And so the goal here is to say, this sentence just doesn't need to be looked at, right? Maybe it's there for context or something, but it's sort of out of scope, right? And so that's kind of the big difference there. And you know, and if you could say, well, maybe you know where the error is and you know how to fix it, and that we show, right? In those cases, yes, fix it and then just approve it. But basically, the sentence is like the unit of cognitive effort for a person, right? If I tell somebody, look at a word in this sentence, he or she can't say, I only need to look at that one word, only pay me for that one word. I have to look at the whole sentence to see if that word makes sense in the sentence. So we're really focused on that sentence level because that's what provides the value. Yeah, and something like Grammarly obviously is in monolingual context, but it's really about like the word and explaining the error and all of that stuff. But when you're buying 1 million translations or 100 million translations, you don't want to know the errors in every word.
Okay, I'm kind of surprised that I'm seeing basically check marks like yes or no on your verification product. From my naive understanding, translation isn't like this. Of course, you can like differentiate between some kind of fact and opposite of that, but in translation you usually also really concerned about register, about poetic qualities, about using proper register, yes, like different semantics and different words in the specific language, and probably in different areas you have different focuses on, like, okay, for poetical, for poesy, for literature it's different, for technical documentation it's different. So do you have kind of scoring on each translation you provide, or do you have attenuation, like saying, okay, well, consider it only about logic here or something else?
So, right, the question is about scores and versus the Boolean, just, you know, check mark versus X. I actually skipped a lot of the history here. So it started out as scores historically in the research world, right? Boolean, you know, binary classification always has some probability attached to it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it turns out when you go to try to roll that out in the real world, you know, it's kind of like if you told someone who's sitting in a self-driving car, you know, 87, 87, it's like, should I brake? Should I jump out? Is this fine, right? They don't know. And so they couldn't consume it, basically. They don't want to know. Again, they're buying 100 million translations here. They don't want to get 100 million scores. They just want to know, oh, 50 million of these I don't have to pay for anymore. Yes or no, right? And don't mess up my quality. So that work essentially fell on us. And it's a huge part of our work. It's, again, one of the things that people underestimate, which is like, how do you safely, reliably go from, you know, these raw model scores to something that approves, you know, as much as possible without damaging the quality. Yeah. So and as you said, you know, it's going to be different for different content types, right? There's a lot of factors in there. And yeah, it's a very difficult part of the problem. But like the tendency over time, as you go from early adopters who are a little bit more willing to deal with stuff like that to mass adoption, is to make things simpler and simpler and simpler, right? So for them, even, right, that automatic post-editing step and the verification steps are just one step. They don't even think about what's going on inside of there. Just like when I sit in a self-driving car, I don't say, what model are you using? I just want to know your safety rating.
Okay, of course I agree on Booleans and product-wise this is reasonable, but what about changing focus for a specific client and specific type of text? Like again, can your clients fine-tune what checkmark is for them? Like again, is it just logic or also using proper lexic and stuff like this?
They do have some control, and it is content type specific. But I think I would. They ask that kind of thing a lot, right? Like, can we do this? Can we do that? Right? There's always that guy in the team, right? But in the end, just to maybe I'll take the self-driving example again. It's like, if this is the world that's mapped out and that's safe and whatever, if you try to use it on something it's not made for, it's not going to do well. And if you're delivering a system, not a model, you're going to stop it from doing that, right? You're not going to let that go there, right? And so essentially how we built things, when I talk about guardrails is, you know, if something comes in that's not, you know, part of what's been seen before, that this system is not built for, it needs to just be rejected. People don't want the freedom to go do that, and we also don't give it to them, right? So this thing is made for a very narrow, specific set of content, and you can't just go deciding on the fly you're going to use it for something new today, you know, sort of on a whim, if you get what I'm saying.
And what kind of backend you are focusing on right now? Like technical documentation samples?
It's a huge mix. So I'd say everything that was mentioned, technical docs, product titles and descriptions, PIM systems, what else? Marketing, UI strings. So I would say the only thing that's been mentioned today that we don't do is poetry and literature, right?
Thanks.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for this great presentation and nice insights. I guess I'm the only one here that I'm purely translator, so I didn't know the fundamental backstage of this engineering. But I have a question. Sometimes we are discussing with AI, some phrases, and we are creating, in case of terminology, Habit knows we struggled, we have created it. And my question is as following: when we come to some conclusion, should I text it back to the system, to AI, to ChatGPT? Would it help it for the future translators? Because in case of terminology, we are creating it day by day. So when we come to conclusions, should we give the right answer so the system knows to help the others? This is my first question. And I have the second question. Sometimes we are cooperating with some kind of companies and the documents are really confidential. But we are asking the question to AI. Where is the break of these ethic limits? Where is the law stands here?
In the kind of workflows that we're talking about, they have centralized everything. They own that management system, that workflow system, right? And you know, the Google Translate is integrated in there, we're integrated in there, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, everything that every translator does is then used to make, you know, basically everything more efficient going forward. Better machine translation suggestions for the translator, hopefully more gets verified and the company's able to translate more, right? So that's all happening. If you're using, you know, the way that, I learned a lot learning about translation, by the way. I knew nothing about how that whole industry, human translation, works, right? What you typically see are these supply chains, right? Where it goes to this agency, to another agency, to another agency, to another agency, whatever. And the person who's, you know, selling the human translation in California doesn't even know, you know, where it goes, right? And in those cases, depending on if there's a workflow system in place or if it's just someone translating in a Word doc or whatever, then often that's not collected. And that's one of the biggest barriers right now is, you know, we all have something, it's the trunk of our car or our cellar, our basement or whatever, that's not in order. And we think, okay, I'll deal with that later. For a lot of these companies right now, they're having to deal with the fact that they're not in control, their data is a mess, et cetera, and they have huge pressure to implement some AI efficiencies, and then I have to tell them when they come to us, say, sorry, you haven't been saving this data over the years. Your agency, has you good, and until you need about a year to get this sorted out, and then we could help you. But right now, you're not in control, right? And so that's very, very common, right? And it's sitting with you and people like you all around the world, and then sometimes with the agency. And as far as the ethical limit, that's really not, we just have to we work with the end buyers directly. We have to do whatever, they say, and all the data that they have is their data, right? So these supply chains do create huge issues. My sort of, as an outsider, I'd say that a lot of it sort of functions on do what you have to do, but I don't want to know about it because, right, this is corporate government mentality, right? But that's very much not the side of the business that we deal with, right? But without a doubt, if any security teams are listening, without a doubt, the biggest security risk, data risk, et cetera, comes from the existing legacy supply chain where people are using, cracked copies of Word on an expired Windows machine, right? Not from some AI system that's in the cloud, right? So.